We begin in Russia. Moscow is currently holding the rotating presidency of the United Nations Security Council. Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov is in New York and chaired a meeting on maintenance of international peace and security. During the opening remarks, Lavrov defended his country's military operation in Ukraine and warned that the world was at a dangerous threshold, possibly even more dangerous than during the Cold War. Here now is a report.
Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov chaired a meeting of the United Nations Security Council on Monday, which meant the representative of a country accused of violating the UN Charter and brutally invading its neighbor was given a platform to warn that the values of the world body were under threat.
As during the Cold War, we have reached the dangerous, possibly even more dangerous threshold.
Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council, which has a rotating monthly presidency. Before Lavrov's remarks, Secretary General Antonio Guterres stated plainly that Moscow's invasion ran contrary to the United Nations mission.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine, in violation of the United Nations Charter and international law, is causing massive suffering and devastation to the country and its people, and adding to the global economic dislocation triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic.
And the U.S. envoy, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, went further.
Our hypocritical convener today, Russia, invaded its neighbor, Ukraine, and struck at the heart of the UN Charter.
Thomas-Greenfield also accused Russia of violating international law by wrongfully detaining Americans, calling for the release of Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich and ex-Marine Paul Whelan. Whelan's sister, Elizabeth, was in the chamber on Monday.
And I want Minister Lavrov to look into her eyes and see her suffering. I want you to see what it's like to miss your brother for 4 years. I'm calling on you right now to release Paul Whelan, Evan Gershkovich, immediately, to let Paul and Evan come home, and to cease this barbaric practice once and for all.
Before the meeting, Elizabeth Whelan accused Russia of arbitrarily detaining Americans as bargaining chips with the U.S.
This is not the work of a mature and responsible nation. It is the action of a terrorist state.
In addition to the U.S., a string of Security Council members, including France and Britain, condemned Russia for its war on Ukraine. But Moscow was not without allies in the room. China, which has a no-limits partnership with Russia, welcomed Lavrov as chair of the meeting and sided with Russia in condemning Western sanctions.
Unilateral sanctions that violate international law must be resisted.
The United Nations is working to save an agreement that allows the safe export of Ukraine's grain from Black Sea ports that could expire on May 18th.
And for more on this, our correspondent Susan Teherani asked the Russian foreign minister if it was time for the United Nations to leave New York, to which he replied saying, "I think it will be good." The question comes in the backdrop of a Russian report which claimed that Moscow wants to see United Nations headquarters moved to Geneva or Vienna.
Minister Lavrov, is it time for the UN to leave New York?
What's that?
Is it time for the UN to leave New York?
Susan also sent us this report from the United Nations headquarters on the latest United Nations Security Council meeting.
Russia's Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov chaired a high-level United Nations Security Council meeting here in New York on Monday. One of two meetings he'll be presiding over while in New York, as Russia has assumed the presidency of the Security Council for the month of April. The topic of this meeting was multilateralism. Lavrov, during his address, criticized the West, particularly the United States, which he said is, quote, aiming for the destruction of globalization and wants to, quote, undermine multilateralism in the Asia-Pacific. Foreign Minister Lavrov also called Zelensky's Ukraine, quote unquote, the Nazi regime in Kyiv. The EU ambassador to the United Nations spoke on behalf of the bloc, criticizing Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But there was no love lost between the United States and Russia, as the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations invited the sister of Paul Whelan, who is a former Marine detained in Russia. The U.S. ambassador to the UN called on Foreign Minister Lavrov to look into Elizabeth Whelan's eyes, in which Lavrov put his head up, acknowledged with a hand, and looked down at his papers once again. The meeting continued and ultimately ended. Susan Tehrani reporting from New York for WION World is One.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.